I stood in the middle of my new apartment, the skyline glittering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was everything I'd worked for every sleepless night, every sacrifice. I sent out the invitations myself to Mom, Dad, and my sister. When the clock struck 7, every chair was still empty. I poured a glass of wine, the bitter silence of the room swallowing me whole, and in that quiet, a cold realization settled in my bones. They never wanted to see me win. My name is Mara Collins, and I am 34 years old. Today, I signed a document that felt heavier than any book I had ever carried, more significant than any diploma. The pen, a cheap blue plastic thing the realtor had handed me, felt absurdly light as it traced the 4 syllables of my name onto the final page of the mortgage agreement. With that last looping "es," the penthouse apartment at Riverstone Heights, the one that sat like a glass crown atop the tallest residential building in downtown Denver, became mine. The realtor, a woman named Carol with a smile as white and perfect as the walls of my new home, slid the folder across the polished desk. "Congratulations, Ms. Collins," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "You must be thrilled." Thrilled wasn't the word. I felt hollowed out, as if every ounce of fight I'd had for the last 15 years had been poured into this single moment, leaving nothing behind but a quiet, trembling void. I nodded, managing a smile that felt like it might crack my face. The reality of it was too vast to comprehend all at once. It was an impossible dream made solid, tangible, something I could touch and prove was real. Growing up, dreams were a luxury we couldn't afford, like brand-name cereal or vacations that didn't involve a tent in a state park. We lived in a double-wide mobile home in a park just outside the city limits, a place where the American dream went to rust. The walls were thin enough to hear our neighbors arguing, and the windows looked out onto a sea of identical metal boxes. My guidance counselor in high school, a well-meaning man with tired eyes, had once looked at my grades and told me to be realistic. He suggested a career as a dental hygienist. "It's stable, Mara," he'd said. "A good life." My mother, whenever I'd talk about wanting to live in the city, in one of those tall buildings with windows for walls, would let out a little sigh. It was the sound of tired disappointment. "Honey, people like us don't get views of the river," she'd say, not unkindly, but with a finality that was meant to clip my wings. "We're lucky if we get a window that doesn't face a brick wall." The voices had become a chorus in my head for years, a constant reminder of my place, of the ceiling they believed was set firmly above me. A girl from a trailer park didn't get a penthouse. It was a rule, as unwritten and unassailable as gravity. Now, standing in the middle of the vast, empty living room, I could feel that rule shattering into a million pieces. The apartment was an ode to light. Sunlight poured in through the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the pale oak floors into rivers of gold. It smelled of new paint, of clean glass, and of the faint, expensive scent of polished wood. I walked from one end of the open-plan space to the other, my footsteps soft on the wood, and the silence was so profound it felt like a presence. I cleared my throat and whispered, "Hello?" The sound, my own voice, rushed back at me, echoing in the high-ceilinged emptiness. It was the sound of a space waiting to be filled, a life waiting to begin, but it was also the sound of being utterly alone. The contrast was dizzying. I had fought my way out of the cramped, cluttered confines of my childhood, only to find myself in a space so large and empty it felt like another planet. I was the sole inhabitant of my own hard-won world. I drifted into the kitchen, a marvel of white granite and stainless steel. The signed contract lay on the island, a stark black and white testament to the impossible. I ran my fingers over my own name, the ink still faintly damp. This piece of paper was a map of my life, the late nights studying at the community college library after a full shift at the diner, the years spent in a cramped studio apartment eating ramen so I could save every spare dollar. The terrifying leap of starting my own small tech consulting firm from my kitchen table. It was all there, condensed into a single, legally binding signature. A single. Hot tear escaped and slid down my cheek, landing with a soft, soundless plop right on the granite countertop. It wasn't a tear of pure joy. It was a tear of exhaustion, of relief, of a deep, aching grief for the girl who had been told this was impossible. It was a tear for every time I had almost given up, for every door that had been slammed in my face. The cool, unyielding surface of the granite was so different from the chipped formica counters of my youth, a physical symbol of how far I had come. This was real. This was mine. My hand trembled slightly as I pulled out my phone. My thumb hovered over the family group chat, a conversation thread titled Simply Family that was mostly used for birthday announcements and links to my sister Rachel's latest blog posts. I felt a familiar knot of hope and anxiety tighten in my stomach. This was the moment. This was the news that would finally make them see. I typed the words carefully, deleting and retyping them 3 times before settling on something that sounded casual, celebratory, and welcoming. Housewarming. Saturday at 7. I'll cook. I added the I'll cook part as a small offering. It was a promise of effort, of care, a signal that this wasn't just about showing off a new space. It was about bringing them into my home, my life. I hit send, and the small blue bubble popped up on the screen. Delivered. I held my breath, watching the screen, waiting for the flurry of exclamation points and congratulations I had pictured in my mind for years. The first hour passed in deafening silence. I unpacked a box of books, the smell of old paper a comforting presence in the sterile newness of the apartment. I lined them up on a built-in bookshelf, my hands moving automatically while my mind was fixed on the small, dark screen of my phone. Nothing. I made myself a cup of coffee, the machine gurgling loudly in the quiet kitchen. I checked again. The message showed as, "Read by Mom, Dad, Rachel." They had seen it. They knew. The silence was no longer passive. It was an active choice. It was a void where a reaction should have been. 2 hours crawled by. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, painting the city in hues of orange and pink. The view was breathtaking, a masterpiece of urban beauty, but I could barely see it. All I saw was the reflection of my own anxious face in the dark screen of my phone. Then, finally, a notification. My heart leaped. It was my mother. I opened the message, my hope so sharp it was painful. Her reply was 5 words long. "We'll see if we can make it." No exclamation point. No question about what I was cooking. No congratulations. Just "we'll see." It was a phrase I knew well. It was the verbal equivalent of a shrug, a polite dismissal wrapped in the guise of consideration. It was what she said when she had no intention of doing something but didn't want the confrontation of saying no. The hope in my chest deflated like a punctured lung, leaving a hollow ache behind. But the desperate, hopeful part of me, the part that had survived for 34 years on scraps of their approval, refused to die. It latched onto the "we'll see," twisting it into a possibility. "They're just busy," I told myself. "They'll move things around." A vivid memory surfaced. Unbidden, I was 9 years old, dressed as a tree in the school play. I had one line. I'd practiced it for weeks. Backstage, I'd spent the entire time peering through a crack in the heavy velvet curtain, scanning the rows of smiling parents for my own. I finally spotted them in the back row, just as my scene started. They were there. They had come. They left before the curtain call. But they had come. That memory became my anchor. They had come then. They would come now. This was bigger than a school play. This was my life's work, manifested in glass and steel. They had to come. Fueled by that fragile, stubborn hope, I spent the next few days in a flurry of activity. I wasn't just preparing for a party. I was building a stage, setting a scene for the validation I craved. I went to the expensive flower market downtown and bought huge bouquets of white lilies and eucalyptus, their clean, sophisticated scent filling the apartment. I bought tall, unscented taper candles and placed them in sleek silver holders. I unpacked my new dinnerware. each piece of pristine white porcelain a blank canvas for the meal I would create. I laid out the placemats, the heavy silver cutlery, the sparkling wine glasses. I set the table for 6 people, an act of pure, unadulterated faith. I even practiced the meal, a complex recipe for pan-seared steak with a red wine reduction sauce, something I imagined my father would appreciate. Every polished glass, every folded napkin, was a prayer, a plea. As I stood back to admire the perfectly set table, the candlelight flickering and dancing across the white plates, a single thought echoed in the vast, quiet space of my new home, louder than any voice. "They'll see," I whispered to the empty chairs. "They'll walk in here, and they'll see that the girl from the trailer park, the one who was supposed to be realistic, did this. They'll see I made it." Finally, the reflection of the setting sun on my phone screen was a brutal, beautiful orange. My mother's words, "We'll see if we can make it," seemed to burn there, a permanent brand on the dark glass. It was a phrase that held the entire history of my family within its 5 syllables, a history built not on love or support, but on the fragile, meticulously maintained scaffolding of appearances. My parents were masters of the artifice. They had divorced when I was 10, a messy, bitter affair that involved slammed doors and hushed, angry phone calls. Yet, to the outside world, and especially during holidays, the Collins family remained a perfect portrait for Christmas, Easter, and Thanksgiving. My father would come over to my mother's house, and they would play their roles with Oscar-worthy precision. They would smile for photos, my father's arm resting lightly on the back of my mother's chair, a gesture of casual ownership that was a complete lie. They would laugh at the same jokes, pass the gravy, and inquire about relatives' health with a synchronized warmth that would evaporate the second the last guest pulled out of the driveway. I learned early on that the truth was an inconvenience, something to be hidden away like dirty laundry before company arrived. The image was everything. What people saw, what they believed, was more real than what actually happened behind our closed doors. Within this carefully curated performance, my sister Rachel was the star, and I was the stagehand. Rachel, 2 years younger, was born for the spotlight. She was pretty, effervescent, and effortlessly charming. My mother saw in Rachel a reflection of the woman she wished she'd been, and she polished that reflection relentlessly. "Be more like Rachel" was the soundtrack of my childhood. It was whispered when I came home with grease under my fingernails from tinkering with my bike instead of practicing piano. It was said with an exasperated sigh when I preferred a book to the high school parties Rachel thrived at. It was the constant, painful reminder that I, in my natural state, was a disappointment. We were a study in contrasts, our paths diverging as soon as they possibly could. Rachel was enrolled in a prestigious, expensive private university on the East Coast, an expense my parents justified as an investment in her future. Her summers were spent in unpaid internships that looked good on a resume. I stayed home, working 30 hours a week at a greasy diner to pay my tuition at the local community college. My education was not an investment. It was a practical necessity, like buying generic brand soap. The disparity in their perception of us was never clearer than the year we both got cars. I was 20, and I had saved for 2 years. Every dollar earned from serving lukewarm coffee and mopping sticky floors going into a tattered envelope under my mattress. I bought a 10-year-old Honda Civic, a reliable, dented little machine that represented my first real taste of freedom. I spent an entire Saturday washing and waxing it until it shone. I drove it to my mother's house, my heart thrumming with a pride so fierce it felt like it might burst from my chest. I pulled into the driveway, expecting, I don't know what I was expecting, a hug, maybe, a "well done, honey." Instead, my mother came out, circled the car once, and said, "It's nice, Mara. Just don't go showing it off to everyone. It's not polite to brag." My pride shriveled. 2 years of hard labor, dismissed as boastful. 6 months later, for Rachel's 19th birthday, a brand new, cherry red Volkswagen Jetta appeared in the driveway. a giant bow on its hood. My parents beamed in photos Rachel posted online. The caption read, "Hard work pays off, so proud of our girl." Her car wasn't a purchase, it was a reward, an achievement. What hard work she had done to deserve it was never specified. The message was clear: my success, earned through grit and sacrifice, was something to be downplayed, while her gifts, bestowed upon her for simply existing, were celebrated as accomplishments. I moved out a few months later. It wasn't a dramatic exit. There was no screaming match, no final, door-slamming confrontation. It was a quiet packing of boxes, a silent acknowledgement that I could not grow in a house where the sunlight was rationed and directed only at my sister. I found a tiny apartment above a laundromat and transferred my diner job to a location closer to my new place, working the late shift so I could attend my classes during the day. I was a cashier, a student, a ghost haunting the aisles of a 24-hour supermarket at 3 a.m, stocking shelves to make rent. Life was a blur of exhaustion and determination. When I did go home for the obligatory holidays, the performance continued, but my role had shifted. I was now the cautionary tale, the prodigal daughter who had chosen the hard road. My father, in a moment of what he probably considered paternal concern, would lean back in his chair after dinner, look at me over his reading glasses, and ask the same question every time. "Still renting, Mara?" It was never a genuine inquiry. It was a judgment. It was a way of measuring my life against their yardstick of success and finding it wanting. Renting was transient, unstable. It was what you did before you grew up and bought a house with a lawn you had to mow on Saturdays. It was a mark of my failure to launch properly. My mother had a more subtle, but no less cutting, method of diminishing me. I once overheard her on the phone with one of her friends, a woman from her book club. "Oh, Rachel is doing wonderfully," she'd chirped, launching into a detailed account of Rachel's latest internship in New York. Then, "Her friend must have asked about me." My mother's voice changed, dropping a little, a note of apology creeping in. There was a pause, just a beat of hesitation, and then she said, "Mara's doing fine." That pause was a chasm, that single word. Fine was a life sentence. Fine was the territory of the unremarkable. It was a C- on the report card of life. It meant I was not failing spectacularly enough to be a problem, but not succeeding enough to be a point of pride. I was simply existing, for years. I told myself I didn't care. I built a fortress around my heart, brick by brick, with every condescending question and every backhanded compliment. I convinced myself that their approval was a currency I no longer accepted. I was independent. I was self-sufficient. I didn't need their validation to know my own worth. I repeated it to myself like a mantra, in my tiny apartment as the washing machines rumbled below, in the library as I highlighted textbooks until my eyes burned, in my office in the early days of my company when I was the only employee. I don't need them. I don't need them. And I believed it, for the most part, until this apartment, this glorious, impossible, sun-drenched apartment. It wasn't just a place to live. It was a landmark. It was a monument to every time I was told to be realistic, to every still renting and every dismissive fine. It was a gleaming 3,000 square foot rebuttal to their entire narrative of my life. Standing here, with the entire city of Denver spread out at my feet, I couldn't be described as fine. This was success. It was tangible, undeniable, and it had a spectacular view of the river. This, I thought, was the thing that would finally break through the facade. They wouldn't be able to diminish this. They would have to look at it, to stand inside of it, and acknowledge what I had built. Not just for myself, but from myself. I didn't just want them to see the apartment. I wanted them to see me, the real me, the one who had fought and failed and fought again, the one who had built a life for herself out of nothing but sheer, bloody-minded will. But as I stood there in the growing twilight, the perfect table set for a family that might not come, a cold dread began to seep into the cracks of my triumphant resolve. I had spent so long focused on climbing the mountain that I never stopped to consider if they even wanted to see the view from the top. I had forgotten a fundamental rule of our family's carefully constructed world. Every story needs a hero and a supporting character. In our story, Rachel was the hero. My success didn't just disrupt the narrative, it threatened to rewrite it entirely. If the daughter who was told she couldn't achieve anything suddenly had the penthouse with the river view, what did that say about the daughter who was given everything and was still just Rachel? What did it say about the parents who had backed the wrong horse? I had foolishly believed my success would be a gift to them, a reason to celebrate. I was only now beginning to understand that to a family that loved appearances above all else, my success wasn't a triumph. It was an ugly, inconvenient truth. It was a mirror held up to their own prejudices, and they were not going to like the reflection. After my mother's lukewarm text, the flimsy hope I'd been clinging to began to fray. A simple group chat message was too easy to ignore, too casual to command respect. I realized I had to make a bigger statement. This wasn't just a casual get-together, it was a coronation of sorts, and it required a royal summons. So I went to a high-end stationery store, the kind of place that smells like money and thick paper, and bought a box of elegant, cream-colored cards with matching envelopes. My handwriting, usually a frantic scrawl, became a slow, deliberate script. I wrote out 6 individual invitations, one for each of them: Mom, Dad, my stepmother Susan, Rachel, her husband Tom, and even one for their 5-year-old, Liam. On the back of each card, beneath the date and time, I added a single, heartfelt line. For the first time, I finally have space for all of us. It was a literal truth. My old apartment couldn't have fit 2 of them comfortably, but it was also a plea. Let this new space be a new start for us. I sealed each envelope, affixed a stamp with painstaking precision, and dropped them into a blue USPS mailbox, the clang of the metal door echoing like a gavel. It was done. It was official. They couldn't ignore this. 3 days passed. The silence from my mail-out campaign was, if possible, even more profound than the silence after the text message. Then, an email notification pinged on my laptop. The sender was Rachel. My breath caught in my throat. I clicked it open. The subject line was blank. The message was short. A masterclass in passive-aggressive dismissal. Hey Mara, got your card? That's cute. Weekends are just super busy for us right now with Liam's soccer and everything. You know how it is. We probably can't make it. But the place looks great in the pics you sent XOXO. Rach. That's cute. The 2 words landed like a slap. It was the verbal equivalent of patting a child on the head for a clumsy drawing. It was what you said about a kitten trying to climb the stairs. Not about your sister's life-altering achievement. My penthouse, my life's work, was cute. The excuse about Liam's soccer was so flimsy, so transparently false. I almost laughed. A 5-year-old's soccer schedule was not an unbreakable commitment that required weeks of advanced planning. It was an excuse, and a lazy one at that. It was a clear, concise message: your big moment is less important than our routine weekend errands. The XOXO at the end was the final twist of the knife, a little flourish of faux affection to soften a blow that was intended to be anything but. The next day, my father called. This was a rare event. He was a texter, not a talker. My heart gave a hopeful flutter. Maybe he was calling to override Rachel's email, to confirm they were coming. Hey, kiddo, his voice boomed through the phone, full of forced cheerfulness. Just got your invitation in the mail. A real work of art. We're so proud of you. Mara. A penthouse. Who would have thought? Huh? The praise felt hollow, a preamble to the inevitable, but I waited. It didn't take long. Listen, he said, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial tone. Susan and I would love to be there. We really would, but you know how she is with driving at night, and all the way downtown, with the traffic. It's just a lot for her. Her nerves aren't what they used to be. I pictured Susan, my stepmother, a woman who had once driven an RV across 3 states to attend a quilting convention. The idea that a 20-minute drive on a well-lit highway would shatter her nerves was ludicrous. It was like Rachel's excuse, a lie. A more thoughtfully constructed lie, perhaps, delivered with a performance of fatherly regret, but a lie all the same. He was using his wife as a human shield to absorb the impact of his rejection. "We'll celebrate next time you're out our way." "Okay," he finished, the cheerful tone returning. "We'll take you out for a steak. My treat?" He was already planning the consolation prize. I murmured something non-committal and hung up, the silence of my apartment rushing back in to fill the space his empty words had occupied. My mother's response came that evening. It was a single text message. "Congrats." That was it. One word, no punctuation, no emoji, not even a capitalized first letter. It was the absolute bare minimum of acknowledgement. A text sent with all the warmth and enthusiasm of a receipt from an ATM. It was a linguistic dead end. There was no follow-up question, no opening for a conversation. It was a period at the end of a sentence I was desperate to continue. I stared at the word, this tiny digital tombstone marking the death of my expectations. I could let it go. I could accept the defeat, cancel the party, and drink the expensive wine by myself. But a stubborn, wounded part of me refused. I had to try one more time. I had to make her say no to my face, not hide behind a one-word text. My thumbs trembled as I typed out a reply, stripping away all my pride, all my defenses. "Mom, it'd mean a lot if you came." It was the truest thing I had written all week. Her reply came back almost instantly, as if she'd been waiting for it. "We'll see." The same 5 words from before. The ultimate non-answer. The polite, familial version of "don't hold your breath." It was a masterpiece of emotional evasion, and it was, finally, the answer I had been dreading. They weren't coming. None of them. And yet, some insane, masochistic part of my brain refused to accept it. The table was already set for 6. The flowers were arranged. The hope, battered and bruised as it was not quite dead. I found myself walking through the grocery store, my cart moving on autopilot. I found a bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon, my mother's favorite, the one she always brought to Thanksgiving. I put it in the cart. I saw a block of sharp cheddar cheese, the kind my father liked to snack on before dinner. In it went. I was shopping for the ghosts of the guests who would not be attending. A pathetic ritual of denial. My final act of delusion was the most elaborate. I remembered my father, years ago, watching me struggle to cook burgers on a grill, saying with a chuckle, "Mara, you're a great kid, but you can't cook a steak to save your life." The comment had stung. Another small piece of evidence in the case for my general inadequacy. I went online and found the website of a private chef, a man who offered in-home cooking lessons. I booked him for Friday afternoon, the day before the party. I was going to learn how to cook the perfect steak. I was going to erase that failure, to present them with a meal so flawless they would have no choice but to be impressed. It was an absurd, extravagant gesture, a desperate attempt to fix a problem that had nothing to do with my cooking skills. The chef, a kind man named Julian, was patient and thorough. He showed me how to season the meat, how to get the pan screaming hot, how to baste it in butter and thyme. The apartment filled with the rich, savory aroma of searing beef. By the end of the lesson, I had cooked a perfect, medium-rare ribeye, with a beautiful dark crust and a warm pink center. I had conquered the steak. I had prepared the perfect meal. I had built the perfect stage. Saturday evening arrived. The sky outside the windows deepened from blue to purple to a velvety black, pricked with the diamond-sharp lights of the city. I lit the candles, their soft, golden light dancing on the polished surfaces of the table. The white plates gleamed, the wine glasses sparkled, the aroma of the food I had spent the day preparing the steak, the roasted asparagus, the garlic mashed potatoes hung in the air. A warm and welcoming cloud. I put on a playlist of soft jazz, the music a gentle murmur in the background. Everything was ready. Everything was perfect. It was a scene from a magazine. A picture of domestic bliss and sophisticated success. I looked at the clock on the oven. 6:59 p.m. 1 minute to go. I smoothed down my dress, my hands clammy. I took a deep breath, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Any second now. The doorbell would ring. Any second now. I would hear their voices in the hall. My phone lay dark and silent on the granite countertop. Every chair at the perfectly set table was still empty. The clock ticked over. It was 7 o'clock. One empty chair. One message that never came. 7 o'clock came and went not with a bang, but with the quiet, almost imperceptible click of the minimalist wall clock I had hung that afternoon. The sound was swallowed instantly by the low, constant hum of the central air conditioning, a sound I had once found soothing, the sound of modern comfort. Now, it sounded like a machine sighing in an empty hospital room. I stood motionless by the kitchen island, my posture as rigid as the decorative statues in the lobby downstairs. I had been waiting for the chime of the doorbell, an elegant, multi-toned sound I had tested earlier, my finger pressing the button just to hear what hope sounded like, but the chime did not come. The silence in the hallway outside my door remained absolute, undisturbed. My own breathing was loud in my ears, a ragged counterpoint to the steady rhythm of the clock. 1 minute passed, then 5, then 10. The perfect celebratory world I had constructed within these 4 walls began to feel like a stage set after the audience has gone home. My phone, lying face down on the granite, was a black mirror reflecting the flickering candlelight. I had resisted looking at it, telling myself that they were old-fashioned, that they would simply show up, that a call or a text was an unnecessary formality, but at 10 minutes past the hour, the fragile logic of that hope crumbled. My hand trembled as I reached for it, my fingers leaving a faint, damp smudge on the cool glass. I swiped it open. The screen flared to life, painfully bright in the dim, atmospheric lighting. My notifications were a barren wasteland. No new messages, no missed calls. I scrolled through my recent call log, a pointless exercise in self-torture. The last call was from the chef, Julian. Confirming our appointment yesterday, I opened the group chat. My message, housewarming, Saturday at 7. I'll cook. Sat there, followed by my mother's, we'll see. Nothing more. They hadn't gotten stuck in traffic. They hadn't had a last-minute emergency. They had simply not come, and they hadn't bothered to invent the courtesy of a lie. The rich, savory aroma of the pan-seared steak, which had earlier filled me with such pride, now turned cloying and heavy in the air. It was the smell of wasted effort, of a feast prepared for ghosts. The side dishes, the roasted asparagus with lemon zest, the creamy garlic mashed potatoes sat on the warming tray, their heat slowly bleeding out into the cool air of the room. The candles, which I had lit with such ceremony at 6:30, continued their slow, silent consumption. I watched one of them, its flame wavering in the draft from the air vent. A single thin trail of white wax crept down its side like a frozen tear. They were no longer symbols of celebration. They were funeral pyres for my expectations. The perfectly set table for 6 looked like a mockery, each empty chair a silent, seated accuser. I had given each of them a place in my new life, and they had refused to even occupy the seat. The silence grew teeth. It gnawed at the edges of my composure. The soft jazz playlist had moved on to a mournful saxophone solo that seemed to echo the hollow ache in my chest. I couldn't bear it. I walked over to the wall-mounted television, a massive screen that was still covered in a protective plastic film, and fumbled for the remote. The screen flickered to life, bathing the room in a cold blue light that fought with the warm glow of the candles. I ripped the plastic film off with a sudden, violent gesture. A game show host was shouting at a deliriously happy couple who had just won a new car. I changed the channel, a nature documentary about predators on the Serengeti. I changed it again, a sitcom, the canned laughter of an invisible audience echoing unnervingly in my empty apartment. I left it there, turning the volume up just enough to drown out the sound of my own thoughts. The mindless chatter and predictable jokes were a shield, a wall of noise to keep the crushing, deafening silence at bay. I poured myself a glass of the expensive Cabernet I had bought for my mother, the deep red liquid catching the light. I walked over to the vast window, the city lights a glittering, indifferent tapestry below. For 45 minutes, I stood there, sipping the wine, watching the tiny headlights of cars move along the arteries of the city, each one filled with people going somewhere, meeting someone. I felt utterly disconnected from it all, a spectator in a glass box, watching a world I wasn't a part of. The TV droned on behind me. The wine did little to numb the cold knot of pain in my stomach. Finally, I unlocked my phone again, not with any hope, but out of the sheer, mindless habit of a lonely person looking for a distraction. I opened Instagram. I scrolled through pictures of my friends' children, of influencers on tropical vacations, of perfectly plated meals, and then I saw it. At the top of the screen, a small, colored circle appeared around my sister's profile picture, indicating she had posted a new story. My thumb, acting of its own accord, tapped on it. The screen filled with a photograph. It was taken at a dinner table. The familiar, slightly dated floral wallpaper of my mother's dining room in the background. My mother was there, a wide, genuine smile on her face, the kind I hadn't seen directed at me in years. My father was next to her, his arm around my stepmother, Susan, who was laughing at something off camera. And in the center of it all was Rachel, her husband Tom beside her, holding up a glass of red wine directly to the camera in a toast. On the table in front of them was a large, steaming pot of what looked like my mother's beef stew, a simple, comforting meal they had eaten together on countless Sunday nights throughout my childhood. The photo was a perfect tableau of cozy domestic happiness. Across the bottom of the image, Rachel had typed in a cheerful, white script, "Family dinner night." The air left my lungs in a single, silent rush. It wasn't just that they weren't here. It was that they were there, together. They hadn't forgotten. They hadn't been busy. They had made a choice. They had chosen to gather at my mother's house, to eat the familiar food, to perform their perfect family portrait, and to pointedly, cruelly, exclude me from it. They had orchestrated a family dinner night on the exact night of my housewarming. It was a message, as clear and brutal as if they had spelled it out in blood. You are not part of this family. My fingers went slack. The wine glass, heavy and slick with condensation, slipped from my grasp. For a moment, it seemed to hang in the air, a perfect, crystalline bubble of red. Then it fell, hitting the pale oak floor with a sound that was both sharp and sickeningly final. The crash shattered the artificial peace of the room, a violent punctuation to my silent heartbreak. The glass exploded, sending a spray of dark red wine and glittering shards across the pristine wood. The wine pooled and spread, a dark, accusing stain, like a wound opening in the floor of my brand-new home. And then, a sound tore from my throat, something I didn't recognize as my own. It was a laugh. It started as a low chuckle, a tremor in my chest, and then it grew, bubbling up into a raw, ragged sound that was half sob, half shriek. It was the most painful sound I had ever made. I laughed at the absurdity of it all. I laughed at the perfectly cooked steaks cooling on the counter. I laughed at the 6 empty chairs. I laughed at my own pathetic, desperate need for their approval, a need that they had just taken and ground into the dirt with a single, smiling photograph. The laughter was a physical thing, shaking my whole body, tears streaming down my face, though I couldn't tell if they were from grief or from the sheer, agonizing force of the sound. When the laughter finally subsided, leaving me gasping and hollowed out, a new feeling began to settle in its place. The pain was still there, a deep, cold ache, but it was now overlaid with something else, something hard and sharp and clear. Ice, the beautiful sun-drenched apartment, my symbol of triumph, suddenly felt enormous and cold. The high ceilings seemed to press down on me. The glittering view of the city felt like the eyes of 1,000 strangers, watching my humiliation. This wasn't a home, it was a mausoleum, a monument to a dream they had just murdered. As I stared at the dark stain of wine seeping into the grain of my floor, a decision formed in my mind, not with heat and fury, but with a calm, chilling certainty. The laughter had broken something inside me, And what was left was not the hopeful daughter, but someone else entirely. If they refused to come and see my happiness, if they would go to such lengths to erase me from their picture of a perfect family, then I would give them a new picture. I would give them one they couldn't ignore, one they couldn't just swipe away. I would make sure they saw me, and it wouldn't be in a smiling photo. It would be on the news. The shards of glass on the floor were the last remnants of my grief. As I knelt, carefully picking up the larger pieces, the ragged, heaving sobs subsided, replaced by a profound and chilling stillness. The hot, messy pain that had torn me apart was crystallizing into something cold, hard, and perfectly clear. My hands were steady. My breathing was even. The part of me that had wept was gone, and in its place was an architect of consequence. Before I swept up the last of the glass, I picked up my phone, my thumb, no longer trembling, moved with deliberate precision. I navigated back to Rachel's Instagram story. The smiling faces, the wine glasses, the cozy domesticity of it all. I took a screenshot. The image, a snapshot of my own erasure, became the first file in a new mental folder. It was Exhibit A. My mind, which had been a chaotic storm of emotion, was now a quiet, efficient machine, processing data, identifying patterns. I didn't need to rage. I needed to think. I knew Rachel worked in marketing. The name of her firm floated to the surface of my memory. Prestige Properties. The name was familiar, but not just from her cheerful anecdotes about office potlucks. I walked over to the sleek, built-in desk by the window and powered on my laptop. A quick search of my email archives for Prestige Properties yielded a result from 8 months ago. It was a building-wide memo from the Riverstone Heights Homeowners Association. It was a warning. Prestige Properties had been making aggressive, unsolicited buyout offers to residents, attempting to acquire the entire building for a fraction of its market value to convert it into luxury short-term rentals. The HOA board had advised all residents to reject the offers and refuse any further contact. The plan had failed, but the name was now lodged in my mind, linked directly to my home. This was the first thread. I pulled on it. Rachel's LinkedIn profile was a monument to self-congratulation, filled with corporate jargon and carefully curated headshots. Her title was Director of Brand Strategy. Her recent projects included urban core redevelopment initiatives. A chill went down my spine. It was a sanitized corporate euphemism for what they had tried to do to my building. She wasn't just a marketer. She was a key player in the very company that had tried to undermine the value and stability of my new home, the home she had refused to visit. The refusal was no longer just a personal slight. It was starting to look like a professional conflict of interest. But how did my mother fit into this? She wasn't a real estate professional. She ran a small, one-woman PR consultancy from her home office, a business she'd started after the divorce. Her clients were mostly local dentists and car dealerships. It seemed a world away from multi-million-dollar real estate deals. I searched the Denver Business Journal's online archives. I typed in Prestige Properties and Riverstone Heights. I found an article from a year ago detailing the company's ambitious expansion plans in the city. The article quoted their CEO, a man with a slick, toothy grin, and then, near the bottom, was a paragraph that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. It mentioned that for their community outreach and public relations efforts in the downtown area, Prestige had retained the services of a local communications expert to help smooth the transition for existing residents. The expert's name was Catherine Collins, my mother. I felt a dizzying wave of vertigo, as if the floor of my penthouse had suddenly dropped away. She wasn't just aware of the plan. She was a paid participant. She was the one hired to put a friendly face on the hostile takeover of her own daughter's future home. She was a co-signer on the contract for the PR campaign designed to displace the very people who were now my neighbors. The irony was so bitter, so profound. It almost made me laugh again. My whole life, they had treated me as if I were financially inept. My father's still renting echoed in my head, a mocking ghost. They had laughed at my first car, dismissed my career, and treated my financial independence as a temporary, slightly embarrassing phase. And all the while, they were involved in a scheme where their own professional success was tangled up in a property they never believed I could own. Now, their contract, their reputation, their income was in the hands of the one person they had consistently underestimated. And I was sitting in the castle they had tried to besiege. The anger was there, a low, controlled burn, but it was logic, not rage, that guided my next steps. I needed to know my exact legal standing. I spent the next 2 hours poring over the mountain of documents from my closing: the purchase agreement, the title report, the HOA covenants and bylaws. It was a dense forest of legalese, but my mind was sharp, focused, and then I found it, buried deep in the HOA bylaws, under a subsection titled Resident Conduct and Commercial Activity. It was a resident disclosure clause. The language was complex, but the meaning was simple and devastating. Any resident, or their immediate family members, was prohibited from engaging in or profiting from any commercial or professional activity directly related to the acquisition, sale, or management of the Riverstone Heights property without providing full, written disclosure to the HOA board. It was a standard conflict of interest clause, designed to prevent exactly this kind of insider maneuvering. They had violated it, Rachel, as the daughter of a resident, and my mother, as the mother of a resident, were both in direct breach of the bylaws governing my home by working on a deal to acquire the building and failing to disclose their relationship to me, a new owner. They had created a massive legal liability for themselves and for Prestige Properties. If I brought this to the HOA's attention, the fallout would be catastrophic. Prestige's deal, which was likely not dead but merely dormant, would be poisoned, and my family's professional reputations would be shattered. They could lose everything. The contract was worth millions. My path was clear. The emotional, messy desire for an apology was gone. This was a tactical operation now. I spent the rest of the night and the following day gathering my ammunition. I created a password-protected folder on my laptop and named it Accountability. I saved the screenshot of Rachel's Instagram story, time-stamped and dated. I downloaded the article from the business journal. I used public records databases to find my mother's business registration and her list of official clients. I went through my text history, screenshotting every dismissive message. My mother's "we'll see" was no longer just a sign of maternal indifference. It was evidence of evasion, a documented refusal to enter a property she was professionally compromised by. Rachel's "that's cute" was no longer just condescending. It was a deliberate minimization of a situation she had a professional duty to disclose. Every unanswered invitation, every flimsy excuse, became a brick in the wall of evidence I was meticulously constructing. A strange sense of calm settled over me. The girl who had set a perfect table and prayed for her family to show up was gone. That girl had been a hopeful child, banging on a locked door, begging to be let in. I was no longer that girl. I was the person who owned the house, and I was quietly changing the locks. I was not a victim seeking pity. I was a calculator, running the numbers, assessing the variables, and preparing to execute a flawless plan. The grief had not disappeared, but it had been transmuted. It was no longer a weakness. It was fuel. It powered a cold, precise engine of logic that was now humming silently in the center of my being. On Monday morning, I sat at my desk, the rising sun glinting off the skyscrapers of the city, my home, my fortress. I opened my email. My fingers flew across the keyboard, composing a new message. It was addressed to the family group chat. The tone was light, breezy, and magnanimous. "Hey everyone," I wrote. "So sorry about the mix-up with the housewarming. Things were so chaotic. I think I got my wires crossed on the dates. My bad. I'd love for you all to come for a proper celebration. How about brunch this Sunday? I'd love to show you the view." I added a smiling emoji at the end. It was a perfect performance of forgiveness, an open-armed welcome. It was also a trap, and as I clicked send, I felt no malice, no glee, only the quiet, certain satisfaction of a plan set in motion. I was inviting them to my home, again, but this time, they would not be the guests of a hopeful daughter. They would be the unwitting attendees at their own reckoning. The email, with its breezy tone and smiling emoji, was a perfectly crafted piece of fiction. I hit send and watched the digital envelope fly into the ether. It was bait, cast into the murky waters of my family's duplicity, and I didn't have to wait long for a bite. Less than 5 minutes later, my mother replied. The speed itself was a confession. Her response was a burst of manufactured enthusiasm. Sounds nice. Sweetie, so sorry about last weekend. It was just one of those crazy weeks. We'll all be there. Can't wait to finally see the place. Love, Mom. The exclamation points were like tiny, frantic flags of relief. The casual lie about a crazy week was offered up without a hint of shame. She was so grateful for the olive branch, so eager to believe her sins had been forgotten, that she practically leaped into the trap. An hour later, a private message from Rachel popped up on my phone. Hey, got your email. Sunday sounds great. Glad you're not mad about last time. Seriously, things have just been insane. It was the classic non-apology, the "I'm sorry you feel that way" of sibling dynamics. She wasn't sorry for what she did. She was just glad I wasn't making a fuss about it. The message was a clear indicator that she knew her actions were wrong, and my perceived silence had been a source of anxiety. My forgiveness was a gift she felt entitled to. I let the message sit for a moment, savoring the depth of her cluelessness. A small, cold smile touched my lips. I typed back, my words a silken promise of what was to come. Never. It's all good. Can't wait to show you something special. I even added a winking emoji. Let her believe the something special was a tour of the master bathroom or the expensive espresso machine. The truth was far more tailored to them. With their attendance confirmed, the operational phase of my plan began. My persona as the wounded daughter was packed away. I was now a producer, a director, and a meticulous event planner. My first call was not to a caterer, but to a freelance journalist I knew from a tech conference a few years prior. Her name was Sarah Jenkins, and she specialized in a certain kind of local journalism glossy, aspirational profiles of Denver's up-and-coming entrepreneurs. Local success stories, she called them. I pitched her my own story, framing it as a feature on a homegrown tech consultant breaking barriers. I've just moved into a new place in Riverstone Heights, I said, my voice pitched to sound proud and a little shy. It's been a long road, and I thought it might make for an inspiring piece for your series. Sarah, smelling an easy and visually appealing story, agreed immediately. I told her my family would be there for a celebratory brunch and suggested it would be a wonderful opportunity to get some candid shots and a few quotes about my support system. They're my biggest cheerleaders. I said, the lie tasting like ash and iron in my mouth. She agreed to come on Sunday with her photographer. Next, I addressed the matter of documentation. Sarah's photographer was for the public narrative, but I needed something for the private one. I ordered 3 small, high-definition spy cameras online, the kind disguised as phone chargers or air fresheners. When they arrived, I spent an evening choreographing the surveillance of my own home. One camera was tucked between 2 thick books on a shelf, its tiny lens having a perfect, wide view of the dining table. Another was nestled within a large bouquet of white hydrangeas that I placed on the kitchen island. The third was placed opposite the largest wall in the living room, the wall that would soon become my main stage. I checked the angles on my laptop, adjusting them by millimeters until I could capture every seat at the table, every possible facial expression. The lighting, a wash of soft morning sun, would be perfect. This would not just be a confrontation, it would be recorded for posterity. On Saturday evening, the night before the brunch, I began to set the scene. I recreated the tableau from the disastrous housewarming with painstaking detail. The same brand of tall, unscented candles, the same pristine white porcelain plates and heavy silver cutlery. The table was set for 6, a ghost of the previous week's pathetic hope, but this time there was a new addition. At each of the 5 place settings intended for my family, I placed a slim, unassuming manila folder. Inside each, I had printed a curated selection of the evidence I had gathered the article from the business journal with my mother's name, screenshots of Prestige Properties' failed buyout campaign, and a printout of the HOA's resident disclosure clause with the relevant section highlighted in yellow. It was a party favor of their own making. The final touch, my masterpiece of quiet vengeance, was the photograph. I had the screenshot of Rachel's Instagram story professionally printed in high resolution, an 8x10 image that captured their smiling, treacherous faces in perfect clarity. I bought a simple, elegant black frame. The final step was to hang it. I chose the center of the main wall, the one my third camera was aimed at. I hammered the nail in myself, the sharp, percussive sounds echoing in the silent apartment. I hung the picture. Then, I angled one of the ceiling's recessed spotlights to hit it directly. The effect was dramatic. The casual, throwaway social media post was now elevated to the status of fine art, an unavoidable testament to their betrayal, displayed for all to see. Their happy family dinner, the one from which I was excluded, was now the central decor of my home. Sunday morning arrived, bright and clear. The journalist, Sarah, and her photographer, a quiet man named Ben, arrived at 10:30. I welcomed them warmly, offered them coffee, and gave them the tour. Playing the part of the humble, hard-working success story, "My family should be here any minute," I said with a bright smile. "They've been so supportive on this journey." Right on cue, at 11 o'clock, the doorbell chimed, not the silent dread of last week, but the sharp, clear sound of a plan coming to fruition. I took a deep, calming breath, smoothed down my dress, and walked to the door. I opened it, and there they were, all of them. My mother in a floral dress, my father in a pressed polo shirt, Rachel and Tom looking like a catalog for suburban contentment. They were holding a bottle of champagne and a ridiculously large bouquet of flowers, peace offerings for a war they didn't know I had already declared. They looked relieved, their smiles a little too wide, their eyes a little too bright. I smiled back, a serene, placid smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Welcome," I said, my voice even and calm. I stepped aside to let them in, their chatter filling the entryway. "I'm so glad you could all make it." As they stepped into the main living area, I watched their faces. They took in the scale of the room, the sunlight, the breathtaking view of the city. There were murmurs of, "Oh, Mara," and "It's beautiful." They saw Sarah and Ben, and their expressions shifted to ones of pleasant surprise and dawning pride. This was a narrative they understood. Their daughter, their sister, was important enough to be interviewed. They were not just guests at a brunch. They were supporting characters in a success story. They preened. They straightened their clothes, ready for their close-up. My father was the first to notice the picture on the wall. He squinted, stepping closer. "Hey, is that?" Rachel and my mother followed his gaze. I watched the recognition dawn on their faces, the smiles faltering, a flicker of confusion and unease in their eyes. But before they could process it, I clapped my hands together lightly, a gracious hostess calling her guests to order. "It's so wonderful to finally have you all here," I said, my voice ringing through the room. "Now it's my turn to host." And for a while, everything proceeded like a perfectly normal party. They answered Sarah's questions with practiced sincerity, painting a picture of a loving, supportive family that had nurtured my ambition. My mother spoke of my determination, my father of my work ethic. Rachel gushed about how proud she was. They sipped mimosas, laughed for the camera, and carefully avoided looking at the photograph that hung on the wall like a loaded gun. It was a masterful performance, one they had been rehearsing their entire lives. They thought this was their scene, their story to tell. They had no idea it was all just the opening act, the calm before the storm. The party began as they expected it would, until I picked up the remote for the television. I let the murmur of their self-congratulatory chatter fill the room for a few more moments, a final, perfect recording of their hypocrisy for the hidden cameras. My mother was telling Sarah, the journalist, about my stubborn streak, reframing it as a charming character trait that led to my success. My father was laughing with Ben, the photographer, making a joke about how he always knew I was destined for big things. They were all so comfortable in their lies, so adept at polishing the family myth for an audience. I gave Sarah a small, apologetic smile. "If you don't mind," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the noise. "I've prepared a small presentation, a little something to honor the people who really made all this possible." A ripple of pleased anticipation went through my family. Rachel shot me a look of genuine, sisterly pride. They thought this was for them. They thought this was their tribute. I aimed the small black remote at the massive, dark screen on the wall and pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life, not with a family photo album or a sentimental video, but with the cold, sterile image of a scanned document. The silence that followed was instantaneous and absolute. Projected 10 feet high was the letterhead of Prestige Properties, crisp and undeniable. Below it, in the dense legal language of a consulting agreement, were the terms of a public relations contract, and at the bottom, 2 signatures, blown up to a monstrous size: the flourishing, arrogant script of Prestige's CEO, and the familiar, slanted handwriting of my mother, Catherine Collins. The air in the room seemed to crystallize. I let the image hang there for a full 10 seconds. The only sound in the room, the almost imperceptible whir of the projector and the soft, suddenly conspicuous click of Ben's camera shutter. I saw Sarah lean forward slightly, her journalist's instincts kicking in, her eyes narrowed in concentration. Then I spoke, my voice low and steady, each word perfectly enunciated to carry across the cavernous room. "Did you know," I began, my eyes fixed on my mother, "that Article 7, Section 4 of the Riverstone Heights bylaws expressly forbids any resident, or their immediate family, from profiting from commercial activities related to the property without full disclosure to the HOA board?" The effect was galvanic. The color drained from my mother's face, leaving behind a waxy, translucent mask of shock. She looked as if she'd been struck. Rachel, ever the performer, tried to salvage the scene. She let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound like glass breaking. "Mara, what is this? This is completely unnecessary," she stammered, her eyes darting nervously between me, the screen, and the journalist, who was now scribbling furiously in her notepad. "Unnecessary," I repeated, my voice devoid of emotion. I gestured to the manila folders sitting untouched at their place settings. "I thought you'd all appreciate a copy of the agenda." I slid my own folder from the table and held up the top sheet, a printout of an internal email I had managed to acquire. "This is a marketing memo, written by you, Rachel. The subject is Leveraging Community Assets. It outlines a strategy to use insider knowledge of resident dispositions to tailor buyout offers. You call it unauthorized marketing access to residential data. I believe the legal term for it is fraud." "That's enough," my father's voice boomed, erupting from the tense silence. He surged to his feet, his face a mask of crimson fury. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at me, his eyes filled with the outrage of a patriarch whose authority had just been challenged. "You're embarrassing yourself, Mara, whatever this is. You stop it right now." I met his glare without flinching. The fear I had once felt in the face of his anger was gone, burned away in the fire of last Saturday night. "No," I said, my voice as hard and unyielding as the granite countertop behind me. "I'm protecting my home." That was the moment everything broke loose. Ben, the photographer, who had been hovering at the edge of the room, seemed to realize this was the real story. He moved to the center of the floor, his camera lifting, the sound of its shutter a rapid, percussive counterpoint to the drama. A flashbulb went off, a brilliant, blinding strobe of light that froze my father in his half-standing position, his mouth open in a silent roar of indignation. It captured my mother, her hand covering her mouth in horror, and Rachel, her face a perfect portrait of panicked disbelief. Flash. Another picture. Flash. Another. They were trapped in the spotlight, their carefully constructed facade being ripped away with every click of the camera. I advanced the slideshow. The next image was Rachel's smiling Instagram post. The cozy family dinner night photo now looked grotesque, sinister, projected on the wall above the real family dinner they had tried so hard to avoid. I turned to face them fully, my voice ringing with a cold, righteous fury that I had held back my entire life. "You wanted a family dinner photo?" I asked, my gesture encompassing the flashing camera, the giant screen, their horrified faces. "Here's one that matters. Here's a portrait of the family as it really is, a picture of conspiracy, of greed, of betrayal. Frame this one. Why don't you—" That broke them. My mother, white-faced and trembling, grabbed Rachel's arm. "We're leaving," she whispered, her voice a hoarse, strangled sound. She started pulling a stunned Rachel towards the door, a retreat from a battlefield where they had been so completely and thoroughly outmaneuvered. My father stood frozen for another moment, his anger rendered impotent by the sheer, undeniable weight of the evidence and the presence of witnesses. He shot me a look of pure, undiluted hatred, the look of a king who has just been deposed by his own child. Then he turned and followed them. As they fumbled for the door, a chaotic, undignified retreat. I said my final piece. I wasn't shouting. My voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried the weight of a judge delivering a final verdict. "This isn't revenge," I said, making sure Sarah and her notepad were listening. "Revenge is an emotional act. This is a business transaction. This is accountability." My mother paused at the door, her back to me. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. She didn't turn around. Then they were gone. The heavy door closing behind them with a soft, definitive click. The apartment was suddenly, profoundly quiet. The only sounds the faint hum of the projector and the scribbling of Sarah's pen. Ben lowered his camera, a look of awe on his face. The air was thick with the aftershock of the explosion I had just detonated. I stood there, not in triumph, but in the cold, clear aftermath of a necessary demolition. I had torn down the rotten structure of my family to protect the foundation of my own life. I looked at Sarah, who was staring at me with a mixture of shock and professional adrenaline. The story she had come here for, a simple puff piece, was dead. In its place was something far bigger, a story of corporate malfeasance, of ethical breaches, of a bitter family drama played out for millions of dollars. As Ben's camera flashed one last time, capturing me standing alone in my magnificent, empty apartment, I knew my work was done. The seeds had been planted. The story was now in the hands of the media. And the internet, I knew, would be happy to do the rest. The quiet in the apartment the next morning was a different kind of silence. It was not the heavy, expectant silence of the first housewarming, nor the tense, brittle silence of the brunch just before the storm. This was a clean, expansive quiet. It was the sound of a space that had been purged, a silence that held not loneliness, but solitude. I had slept a deep, dreamless sleep, the first in years that wasn't tinged with the familiar anxiety of trying to be good enough. When I woke, the morning light was pouring through the windows, soft and gray. I didn't reach for my phone immediately. I simply lay there, listening to the gentle hum of my new life. When I finally did pick up the phone, it was not to check for messages from my family, but to search for the online edition of the Denver Chronicle. Sarah Jenkins had worked fast. There it was, on the front page of the local news section. The headline, stark and professional, conflict of interest allegations, taint, Riverstone PR deal. The article was a masterpiece of journalistic efficiency. It laid out the facts coolly and cleanly, detailing Prestige Properties' previous attempts to buy out the building and their retention of my mother's firm. It quoted me directly, my words about accountability and protecting my home, lending a sober gravity to the piece. It mentioned the documented evidence I had provided and the HOA's strict disclosure clause. Ben's photographs were used to devastating effect one of my father, his face contorted in impotent rage, and another of my mother and Rachel, their faces a mask of shock and horror, frozen in the brutal glare of the flash. The final photo was of me, standing alone by the window after they had fled. My expression calm, the city lights glittering behind me. The caption simply read, "Mara Collins, in her Riverstone Heights apartment." The fallout was immediate and predictable. The article itself was only the first domino. By 9 a.m., my phone began to ring. The first call was from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, it rang again. A different unknown number. Then another. Reporters. Smelling blood in the water. Then came the calls I was expecting. My father's name flashed on the screen. I watched the phone vibrate on the granite countertop. The sound of frantic, angry buzz. I did not pick it up. A few minutes later, Rachel's name appeared. I declined the call without a second thought. The incessant ringing was a frantic knocking on my door from a world I no longer wished to inhabit. I switched the phone to silent and turned it face down. I walked to the kitchen and began the slow, deliberate ritual of making coffee. I ground the beans, the whirring of the grinder a satisfyingly mundane sound. I filled the kettle, boiled the water, and slowly poured it over the grounds, the rich, dark aroma filling the quiet apartment. It was a simple, grounding act, a declaration of normalcy in the face of the chaos I had unleashed. With the warm mug in my hands, I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows and pressed a button on the wall. The sheer, motorized blinds, which I had kept down since the disastrous brunch, began to rise in a smooth, silent ascent. The full, brilliant light of the morning flooded the room, chasing the last of the shadows from the corners. The apartment, which had felt like a cold, empty stage, was finally, truly, a home. It was mine, and I had successfully defended its borders. As the day wore on, I watched the story metastasize online. Sarah's well-reported local piece was picked up by national blogs, its professional tone stripped away and replaced with the sensationalism the internet craves. The headlines were cruder, more dramatic. Tech millionaire exposes her own family's shady real estate deal. Family feud goes nuclear in luxury high-rise. One particularly lurid blog ran with the title, "The Tenant Who Burned Her Family to the Ground." I read the comments, a strange, dispassionate observer in my own life story. Strangers were choosing sides, debating the morality of my actions, calling me a hero, a monster, a cold-blooded snake, a feminist icon. It was all noise. None of it touched the profound sense of peace that had settled deep in my bones. I felt no regret, not a flicker. The constant, lifelong ache of striving for their approval. An ache I had carried for so long I had mistaken it for a part of my own anatomy, was simply gone. Its absence left behind not a void, but a vast and tranquil quiet. I had amputated a diseased limb, and for the first time, I felt whole. Late in the afternoon, I learned of the real-world consequences through a follow-up alert from the Chronicle. Prestige Properties had issued a statement. They claimed to have no prior knowledge of their contractors' familial conflicts and announced that Rachel Collins had been suspended indefinitely, pending an internal investigation. Her career, the one my parents had so carefully curated and celebrated, was in ruins. The article also noted that several corporate clients of my mother's small PR firm had severed their ties in light of the investigation into her unethical practices. The business she had built, her small kingdom of influence, was crumbling. I read the words, and I felt nothing. It was not glee, not satisfaction. It was simply the logical conclusion of a mathematical equation I had set in motion. It was the sound of a bill coming due. Just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the living room floor, my phone buzzed, even on silent mode. I glanced at the screen. It was my mother. This time, I knew I had to answer. This was the epilogue. I picked up the phone and swiped to accept the call, putting it on speaker so I wouldn't have to hold the poison so close to my ear. For a moment, there was only the sound of her ragged breathing. Then, her voice, thin and brittle, a sound I had never heard from her before. "Why?" she whispered. "After everything we did for you, why would you do this to us?" The question was so perfectly, predictably them. The complete absence of self-awareness, the immediate casting of herself as the victim, of me as the ungrateful, monstrous aggressor. The old Mara, the child who lived inside me for so long, would have screamed. She would have listed every slight, every dismissal, every moment of casual cruelty. She would have demanded an apology that would never come. But that Mara was gone. I was calm. I looked out the window, at the city lights just beginning to flicker to life. I thought of the empty chairs, the cooling food, the desperate hope of a daughter who just wanted her family to be proud of her. "Because I invited you to see my home," I said, my voice soft, almost gentle, but infused with the unbreakable strength of a truth finally spoken. "Not to destroy it." The line went utterly silent. I could feel the weight of her stunned comprehension across the miles. There was no defense against that statement. It was simple, it was complete, and it was devastatingly true. I had not attacked them. I had defended myself. I had not sought to ruin them. I had sought to share my life with them, and they had been the ones with treacherous intentions. The narrative she had clung to her entire life of her as the benevolent mother and me as the difficult, ungrateful child had shattered against that one. Simple sentence. After a long, static-filled moment, I heard a soft click. She had hung up. I ended the call and set the phone down. I did not cry. I did not feel a surge of victory. I simply felt finished. The final tie had been severed, not by my anger, but by her inability to face the truth. I stood at the window and looked out at the city I had conquered. Below, the South Platte River snaked through the heart of Denver, a dark, shimmering ribbon in the twilight. It had been there long before I arrived, and it would be there long after I was gone. It moved with a steady, implacable force, carving its own path through the landscape, indifferent to the buildings that rose and fell on its banks. It didn't need anyone's permission to flow. It didn't need anyone's approval. It simply was. And for the first time in my life, I understood exactly how it felt. The week that followed was an exercise in acclimating to a new atmosphere. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that was both irrevocably changed and strangely the same. The initial media frenzy, a roaring bonfire of clicks and comments, dwindled to embers and then to smoke. My phone, which had been a relentless beacon of accusation and inquiry, fell silent. The story was over for the world, replaced by the next outrage, the next scandal. For me, it was the first week of a new life, and I moved through it like a deep-sea diver slowly ascending to the surface, wary of the bends. I established a routine. I would wake with the sun, make my coffee, and work for hours at my desk. The city spread out below me not as a symbol of conquest, but simply as my neighborhood. I unpacked the last of my boxes, filling the empty shelves and closets, populating the vast, silent spaces with the small, ordinary artifacts of my life. I learned the sounds of the building, the gentle hum of the elevator in the distance, the faint, far-off cry of a siren in the streets below, the whisper of the wind against the thick plate glass of the windows. The apartment was no longer a fortress or a stage. It was slowly, tentatively, becoming a home. But there was still a lingering sense of unreality, as if I were a guest in this new, quiet life. The peace I felt was real, but it was a fragile, newborn thing. The ghosts of the past had been exorcised, but their shadows still clung to the corners of the room. I had won. I had achieved the accountability I had sought, but the final, definitive punctuation mark to the long, painful sentence of my family life had not yet been written. I was living in the space after the last word, a silence that was not yet resolution. It came exactly 1 week after the brunch, on a quiet Sunday afternoon. I was in the living room, reading a book, the silence broken only by the soft rustle of turning pages. I heard no knock, no chime of the doorbell, just a faint, whisper-thin scraping sound from the hallway. I lowered my book, my senses suddenly on high alert. I walked to the door and looked down. A plain white envelope, with no stamp or address, had been slipped under the threshold. It lay on the pale oak floor, a stark, silent intruder. My name, Mara, was written on the front in my mother's familiar, slanted handwriting. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't tremble. I simply felt a sense of inevitability, the quiet click of the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. I bent down, picked it up, and carried it over to the kitchen island, the place where all of this had begun. The envelope was not sealed. I pulled out its single content. It was a photograph, faded and slightly dog-eared, its colors muted by the passage of 2.5 decades. It was a picture of my family, taken on a bright, sunny day in front of the double-wide mobile home that had been the entire world of my childhood. I was about 9, a skinny, gap-toothed kid in overalls, squinting into the sun with a hopeful, unguarded smile. Rachel, at 7, was already a performer, one hand on her hip, her head tilted at a practiced angle, and my parents stood behind us, their arms around each other in a pose of unity that the photograph's emulsion had somehow failed to capture as a lie. They were younger, less worn down, but the strain was already there in the tight set of my father's jaw, in the faint, tired sadness in my mother's eyes. Behind us, the mobile home looked small and shabby, a metal box of forgotten dreams. It was a portrait of a life I had spent 15 years running from, a past I had tried to bury under layers of ambition and success. I stared at the image of the girl I had been, this hopeful, smiling child who had no idea of the long, lonely road ahead of her. I felt a pang, not of sadness, but of a deep, compassionate pity for her. She had deserved better. She had deserved a family that saw her, that cherished her, not one that treated her as a secondary character in her own life. I turned the photograph over. On the back, written in the same slanting script as my name on the envelope, were 5 simple words. "You were right. We should have come." I read the words once, then twice. It was not an apology. There was no, "We're sorry." There was no acknowledgement of the years of pain, the dismissals, the casual cruelty. An apology requires empathy, and empathy was a language my family had never learned to speak. This was something else. It was a concession. It was the white flag of surrender from an army that had been comprehensively defeated. It was a statement of fact, a final, reluctant admission that they had been wrong, not just about that night, but about everything. In their world of images and appearances, they had misjudged the one person who dealt in the currency of reality. They should have come. It was the closest I would ever get to a confession, and I knew it was all I would ever receive. And it was enough. The anger, the cold, hard engine of my revenge had been fueled by their denial. With this admission, however meager, however emotionally sterile, the engine sputtered and died. The fight was over. There were no more battles to be won. I walked over to the wall where my framed business degree hung next to the signed, framed contract for my penthouse. These were the testaments to my new life, the proof of my success. With a strange sense of ceremony, I took the old photograph and, using a small piece of archival tape, I placed it on the wall right beside them, the faded, grainy image of the mobile home next to the crisp, legal document for the penthouse, the hopeful, gap-toothed girl next to the formidable woman she had become. It was not a shrine, it was a map. It was the whole story, the origin and the destination, displayed side by side. It was my acceptance that I was not one or the other. I was the entire journey between the two. I stepped back and looked at the wall, and for the first time, there were no tears. There was no rage, no lingering bitterness, just a profound, quiet sense of an ending, a long, painful chapter of my life, a story I had been trying to rewrite for decades, was finally, mercifully, over. It was not a happy ending. There was no tearful reunion, no cathartic forgiveness. I did not forgive them. Forgiveness was a gift, and it was one they had not earned, but the need for revenge, the burning desire to make them see, to make them pay, had been extinguished. I didn't need it anymore. The accountability had been delivered, the truth had been spoken, and I was free. In that moment of release, the apartment itself seemed to transform. The air felt lighter. The vast, empty spaces no longer felt like a symbol of my loneliness, but like a testament to my freedom. This was not a statement to my family anymore. It was not a weapon or a shield. It was simply my home. And for the very first time, it felt completely, truly, and peacefully mine. I walked over to the wine fridge and pulled out the bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon, the one I had bought for my mother. I opened it. The soft pop of the cork, a gentle, celebratory sound in the quiet room. I poured a glass, the deep red liquid catching the afternoon light. I turned on my stereo, and the smooth, melancholic notes of a Miles Davis trumpet solo filled the air. I sat down in the large, comfortable armchair that faced the window, the one I had sat in while I watched the world go on without me. I took a sip of the wine. I looked out at the city, at the river, at the endless sky, and I sat alone. But this time, the silence wasn't cold. It was warm. It was full. It was the sound of peace. The night air was cool and clean, a welcome contrast to the conditioned atmosphere of the apartment. I stood on the balcony, my hands resting on the cold, smooth surface of the glass barrier. 34 floors below, the city of Denver was a sprawling, glittering galaxy of light, a complex and beautiful circuit board humming with a million different lives. The distant sound of traffic was a soft, constant roar, like the ocean. It was a sound I had once associated with being trapped, the sound of a world that was always moving on without me. Now, it was the rhythm of my own life, the steady pulse of the city that was now my home. The silence up here wasn't empty. It was vast. It was the silence of altitude, of perspective, of having finally climbed high enough to hear yourself think. I lifted the wine glass to my lips, the deep, dark red of the Cabernet, a stark contrast to the glittering lights beyond. I didn't drink. I just watched the way the city was captured and distorted in the curve of the glass. The sharp white headlights of cars became long, fluid streaks of silver. The warm, golden squares of office windows blurred into a soft, impressionistic haze. The entire sprawling, chaotic, beautiful city was contained right here, in the palm of my hand, in the dark surface of the wine. I could see the reflection of the night sky above, a few determined stars managing to pierce the veil of the city's glow. This glass held everything. It held the darkness and the light, the journey and the destination, the struggle and the quiet triumph. It was a world I had once only been able to dream of, a view I had only seen in magazines and movies. And now I was not just looking at it, I was holding it. As I stood there, lost in the quiet contemplation of the view, a sharp, jarring sound sliced through the peace. My phone, which I had left on the small table by the balcony door, began to ring. Its cheerful, generic ringtone was an alien sound in this new, quiet world. It was a summons from the past, a frantic, desperate knock on a door I had already closed and locked. I didn't move to answer it. I didn't even turn to look at the screen. It could have been my father, his voice thick with a rage that had finally curdled into a plea. It could have been Rachel, her practiced composure finally shattered, wanting to scream or to cry or to beg. It could have been a lawyer, a reporter, a curious distant relative who had finally decided to weigh in. It didn't matter. There was nothing left to say. All the words had been spoken. All the evidence had been presented. The trial was over. The verdict delivered. To answer the phone now would be to agree to an appeal, to reopen a case that was, for the health of my own soul, permanently closed. Their voices, once the arbiters of my self-worth, were now just noise. The ringing continued, a frantic, insistent pulse in the calm of the night, and I let it. I let it ring and ring until the automated silence of voicemail finally took over, a digital admission of defeat. My own silence was the only answer they would ever get. I looked down at the tiny moving lights of the cars below, each one a story, a destination. I thought of all the times I had shown up, I had shown up to my shifts at the diner, my eyes burning with fatigue. I had shown up to my classes at the community college, my backpack heavy with books and a future no one else believed in. I had shown up to my tiny, cramped office in the early days, the only employee of a company that existed solely on my own sheer force of will. I had shown up to my own life, day after day, year after year, with no applause, no encouragement, and no one there to cheer me on. I had set a table for them, prepared a feast, and they had refused to come. It was the final, most painful, and most liberating lesson they had ever taught me. The only person whose presence you can ever truly count on is your own. I took a slow, deep breath, the cool night air filling my lungs, and I whispered the words to the city, to the stars, to the quiet, listening night. They didn't show up, but I did. It was the simplest of truths, but it landed with the force of a revelation. It was the final, quiet click of everything falling into place. A faint, slow smile touched my lips, a smile not of triumph or of victory, but of a deep, unshakable peace. I turned from the railing, my back to the magnificent view, and looked through the clean glass of the balcony door, back into the apartment. From this angle, I could see the wall where I had hung the documents of my new life, and there, reflected in the glass, a faint, ghostly image superimposed over the warm light of my living room was the faded photograph of the gap-toothed girl in overalls, standing in front of a metal box on a patch of dirt. She was behind me now, a part of my history, a part of the story that had brought me here. She was not a ghost to be exorcised, but an ancestor to be honored. She had done her part, she had survived, and I had done the rest. I looked past her reflection, through the glass, at the life I had built, and in that moment, I understood. The view was never about the apartment. It was not about the money, or the address, or the 34 floors of concrete and steel. The view was the ambition. The view was the stubborn, irrational belief that a girl from a trailer park deserved to see the stars. The view was the unwavering vision I had held in my own mind, a private, sacred landscape that no one else could see, but that I had never, for 1 second, stopped believing in. They hadn't wanted me to have it, but they had never had the power to take it away. It was an asset they could never touch, a property they could never devalue. I smiled again, a soft, slow smile that was full and deep and real. The view was always mine. My hand reached for the light switch by the door, the one that controlled the soft, warm lamps of the living room. I flicked it off. The apartment behind me plunged into darkness, my own reflection in the glass disappearing, leaving only the ghost of the photograph and the endless glittering city beyond, a final silhouette against the night. Then, black. No one needed to know what happened next. No one needed an explanation. I had invited them into my world, and they hadn't come. The end. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let me know. And feel free to share your own thoughts on Mara's journey. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video, and hitting that hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you.